So Fiona Dean is an assistant director at the London Borough of Camden. She joins us to talk about how they dealt with the crisis in managing libraries with a reduced amount of subsidy. So it's an interesting way of thinking very differently about some of our park challenges. So Fiona, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have to say that I am also responsible for parks and open spaces, so I have some connection with you. And of course there are many parallels between the two services. They are both universal, they're open to everybody. Parks and libraries both have very passionate communities that use them actively and that are always very willing to give their time, but also very willing to talk to us and tell us when things aren't going quite as they would like or in the way that they would like. So I'm just talking to you today very quickly about one approach that we adopted within Camden, really to meet the financial challenge and the financial crisis that a number of local authorities are finding at the moment, and this will be familiar to all of you. So the backdrop within Camden, obviously densely urban built up area, huge polarisation of wealth and poverty, huge health inequalities, but some very well loved, very well used public services, libraries of course being one of them and being at the centre of it. We've got the diverse community and our services pretty much were reflecting that type of use. But the funding gap that we found ourselves facing in 2011 were to take out £83 million over 3 years, and in fact we now have another 70 million to find from 2015 onwards. So in real terms that's probably around a 40% reduction in funding that's available to provide public services locally. So within Camden we had to look at libraries in the same way that we were looking at all of our other services, and we set ourselves the task of taking off 25% of funding in libraries, which is around £2 million all told. So the approach that we had was very much looking at the evidence and the data and the policy and the strategic framework that we were going to adopt for our public libraries. This is a map of 2011 where we had 13 public libraries in a borough of around 8 miles. We also had a mobile library, a schools library and a home library service. So a very, very well resourced service in quite a small part of London. And in order to take the savings out, we quickly reached the conclusion that around 4 of our libraries had to close. They were no longer required in terms of our obligations under the Public Library Act. And of course libraries with parks in many respects are discretionary, so there were some very real tough choices that our politicians had to face. So we were looking at the libraries in the top north part of the borough, where we found that naturally, ironically, some of our more affluent parts of the borough, that some of our residents were within a 10-minute walk of up to 4 libraries. Clearly that's a provision that we couldn't sustain. The reason I mentioned actually the strategy and the policy framework is, as we found, actually making changes in this way, you really do need a very robust approach to it. You need a robust approach from the politicians, but you also need to be able to justify and evidence why you're taking these decisions as a council. We faced a judicial review over the closure of our libraries, and in fact I think the only reason that was withdrawn at the last minute was because we were able to demonstrate where we'd taken full account of equalities impact assessments and all of the other things that you would expect that you would need to do. So where we ended up with was a decision to close 4 libraries. However, 3 public buildings, 3 of those library buildings, we decided we were going to offer them up to the community to come forward in an innovative way to talk to us about whether they might be able to run a different service. We weren't actually, ironically, specifying it was a library service, but we said these are valued buildings, come forward and talk to us. So we ended up with 1 closure and 3 community libraries. They were all community libraries in the end. And I think the reason that they have flourished, and they have flourished 2 years on, is because we had a very passionate, very well connected communities that formed around them. Ironically, the people that are now running these libraries were not the people that were on our Friends of Libraries groups. They were a group groups in many respects that had a particular passion and an interest, which was in protecting public service delivery of it. The sorts of skill set that was then required in order to take these buildings forward and turn them into valued community resources, they drew on a wider mix than that. So we've got some really innovative thinkers that sit on the various boards of the 3 community libraries, moving them forward. So I think the things that made this work is a strong sense of political will and determination that these were going to be buildings that we looked at a different approach for, a very strong connected community, huge sense of passion within the community. I mean, I don't think you can underestimate the level of commitment that's required if people are going to take over and run these sorts of spaces in a way that makes more sense to them and more sense to them in their particular area. Huge amount of investment in time and resource from the council and from the community groups to make this work, and it's something that doesn't happen overnight. It does require a level of trust, it does require a level of hard work and commitment on everyone's part. And certainly within the council we had to think of some really different ways of managing things. We've had a fairly paternalistic approach to we know what's right and we know that this is the approach that you should have. Actually, by saying that these are buildings that you can take over and you come to us with new ideas, made some absolutely hugely innovative thought processes and challenges come forward for us and for the groups. So 2 years on, we have flourishing community libraries, huge numbers of volunteers. One library in particular has 167 volunteers. It's had to close its waiting list because it's not able to sustain that. It has a huge range of author events, publishing events that we weren't able to support locally. I think moving forward, my only conclusion, and perhaps the relevance back to parks and to green spaces for me, is that we often think about community management as a stopgap because funding's going to be taken away. However, the learning that I've got from our community library experience is actually we should have had that conversation a lot earlier with people and start thinking a lot earlier about if we withdraw or if we are trying to remodel things in a different way, what are your ideas? And let's share that and be much more open in terms of generating those coming forward. So hopefully, even though it's libraries, it's not parks, there was something in there that was relevant to you, and I'll be happy to speak to anybody afterwards. Thank you.